And I appreciate that. And look, I mean, we're going to have to shut that down for the weekend to get the work done that's got to be done. There's going to be some disruption. But what we will make sure is that we are giving as much advance notice, to folks so they know where the proper ways will be to avoid that closure during the time of construction.
Okay. And look, I'm not an engineer, but if you could just make sure that those closures are absolutely necessary, that'd be appreciated as well.
Okay, sure.
And lastly, I drove up to Albany this morning and heard apocalyptic weather reports about coastal flooding this weekend. And actually, after having lived through Irene and Sandy, take that seriously. So I just ask that you spend some time this week considering how that will impact coastal areas in our region and help us be prepared in case the flooding is more serious than we'd like.
Right, and just so everybody knows, we've been meeting, they're meeting right now on it. We've been in discussions since yesterday with New York Responds, Homeland Dishes, and other emergency service providers, coordinating efforts. We're tracking the storm to see what happens. Just know that we have all of our salt sheds are fully up. They're full on Long Island. We have plenty of equipment and manpower, and we're prepared to respond.
Thank you. The governor, and I appreciate that. The Governor's Office of Storm Recovery has worked with our communities to come up with coastal mitigation projects, sometimes very involved projects that cost a lot of money, and we are very excited for that, but they're not there yet. And obviously that's not your department, but the point is we are almost in many cases no more better prepared for flooding than we were the day before Sandy. So please keep that in mind in making your preparation. Yeah, and I will, and I have some familiarity with that from my previous career. And you're correct. There's been a lot of with the erosion of the coastal seagrasses in particular, that acted as kind of a protective barrier. So I know the requisite agencies, DEC, EFC, and others are working with EPA to secure funding to really make sure that those protection barriers are in place. Okay, thank you. I look forward to working with you on these projects. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Senator Michael Ransenhoffer.
Good morning. Thank you, Commissioner.
Good morning.
There we go. I just want to ask you about one of the comments that you had made earlier when Senator Young asked you about parity, and you were talking about your budget, and you said words to the effect that you're given a budget to administer the Department of Transportation, and parity, that's not your issue. It is my issue, and it is an issue for a number of people, my colleagues, especially upstate, who are very concerned about parity, because if the money is not flowing to our region, then the roads and bridges are not being adequately addressed. So I just want to tell you that that is a concern of mine. And one of the things that you mentioned is right now you're readdressing the formula. And several years ago, the formula was recalculated to the advantage of some areas and then to the disadvantage of other areas. My area in particular, the Western New York region, did not benefit by the recalculation of the formula. So if you're now revising the formula again, this will be the third reiteration of this formula for distributing funds. And I wanted to ask you, when is the formula going to be ready? And why is the formula being changed again? Because it seemed like when you made the second change, it was more subjective as opposed to just number of lane miles, as it had been previously for many, many years. So what's the rationale behind the readjustment of the formula? Because that ties into the parity question, which I believe that my area, Western New York, was adversely affected. So can you tell me when it's going to be done and why it's going to be done and what the new formula is going to be and how it's different from the second version?
We're not changing previous formulas. I talked about the development of a formula for the new Pave New York program, and that really will help support dollars that localities are receiving, otherwise through CHIPS. So it'll be in addition to. So we are creating a formula for the distribution of those funds. When it will be done, I can't tell you with certainty. I would hope that it would be done by late spring, but we are working on that now. I'm hesitant to give you a time frame because, candidly, I don't know what it is, and I don't want to be wrong. But we are working on a new formula for the distribution of those dollars for the Pave New York program.
Okay, planning on getting those dollars out the door this year?
I'm sure that the locals would love us to do that, and I recognize, having been in that position as well, how important that is. So when we're ready to go, we'll want to make those disbursements as soon as we can.
Okay, because one of the things that we deal with just on a day-to-day basis, and this was brought up earlier as well, in terms of your letting process and then your reward process. I mean, all too often in my experience is, you'll be soliciting bids in February and in March and April, and then you get backed up because of the construction season, and the project gets done the following year. The concern I have for your Pave New York and Bridge New York program is that if you're not going to have your formulas in place until the late spring, how can you possibly then do the letting process, award the contracts with all the time delays that are built in, and actually get the work done this year? So that's my concern, is that we can do the work this year. So how we can be able to actually get the projects out the door, get the men and women working, get the roads paved this year with that timetable that you've alluded to.
Right. And so, I mean, you're correct to point that out. That's a discussion that I had soon upon my arrival at the department, was the coordination and the timing of the lettings and how the construction, efforts roll out. Absent from the funding piece. We have a short window for construction in New York State, let's face it. It's about 5 months, 6 months. This year was a little better because we've, so far, knock on wood, had a pretty fair and mild winter. But having said that, it's really a timing issue and a coordination issue. So as we develop this formula and as we understand where projects lie, some projects may not be just a one-year summer project as well. They're all different. But it's best that we can coordinate those. We want to do that for efficiencies on the local level, and candidly for efficiencies from our end as well. Because if we have dollars available to support local efforts, we want to get those out the door.
Okay, because one of the comments that you also made earlier, and I quote, you said time is money. And obviously, if the projects are delayed, they're going to be more costly. If they're delayed into the next construction season, the costs are going to go up more than anybody wants to do. So what can you say to assure us that there's going to be some sort of change within the department to get these projects done more quickly?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not going to make a promise about something that might happen in the weather to delay a project or some unforeseen event. Many times in construction in particular, sometimes you find things you never planned on. So there's a list of variables that can happen during a construction project that might delay it. Not in all cases, it could happen. But to the best of our ability, we are looking at how we can better coordinate the release of funds, getting projects let so that they're coordinated so that without a hiccup, they can be done in a timely manner.
Okay, let me just switch gears a moment to public transit and the disparity between the upstate and the downstate area. We have transit systems in our area that have had capital projects on the back burner for years. One in particular, an escalator, which transports people up and down, which has been inoperable, and it just took forever to get fixed. You have systems that want to expand bus service. You have systems that want to purchase new buses. And, at least what I view as a rather meager increase in funding for upstate public transit. I mean, I just don't know how you can ask them, to continue to just put these projects on hold, especially after your comment of time is money. The longer you wait, the more expensive the buses cost. The longer you wait, the more expensive it costs to fix the elevator. What assurances do we have that this money is actually going to be there that these transit systems can use?
Well, let me say that about 2 months ago, I took the time to meet with all the transit operators to hear firsthand from them. And while some may have some capital needs, largely it was operational. But I've listened to them, and part and parcel, that's why we want to ensure that, when funds, and hopefully as the budget is passed, these additional resources are made available, that we can get to those transit operators who need that operating funds. There is an additional $5 million put in for capital funds. We'll go through that assessment. I won't speak to it because I haven't done it, but we will be going through that assessment as well to identify the capital needs and how those can be distributed upon need.
Okay, let me just touch on two other areas. You mentioned this airport competition. There
Yep.
are going to be 5 awards, and I think 79 or 84,
74.
that are going to compete. One of the things I just want to ask you is, when you ask an airport to come up with some sort of plan, I mean, they have to spend a lot of money in terms of architects, engineers. This costs tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars for these type of plans. So while they're going to be helpful, but if you only have, maybe 5 or 6% of the airports receiving money, where is the incentive for an airport who has very limited funds right now to expend hundreds of thousands of dollars for design projects if they have a very low chance of receiving any funds?
Right, well, that's assuming they all have to spend that money, because they might not all have to. If they have an aggressive build-out program, they may need to bring in contractors to help fulfill that design project, as an example. Other airports may simply need a jet bridge, which is the piece of equipment that you walk out the door to that connects to the airline, to the airplane itself. Their needs are different. For people who are looking to do a more aggressive build-out of an airport, they would likely utilize outside consultants. But for some of the smaller airports that, frankly, are throughout New York State, their needs may not be the same. So I can't speak intelligently to whether or not they all spend $100,000 or not. My guess is, based on past experience, that's not completely true, but I would acknowledge that there are airports that likely will have development plans or have those already in their back pocket. Many airports, federal funding is the large driver for airports across New York State and the country. We get the money from the Fed. And so most airports have plans already developed. They may have to upgrade them, they may have to make some adjustments, but by and large, most airports do have plans on the table.
Okay, let me just close with one question. You talked about the MWBE program.
Yep.
In some areas of the state that works great. In other areas, there's a lot of time spent getting waivers because it's just not being met. And back to your time is money, it just takes forever to get this waiver. So I'm wondering what your department can do to speed up that process so projects can be done more quickly if that goal, although lofty, is not able to be met in the community. And I'll stop asking questions and just listen to your answer.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a good question. So we have met with ESD, who's really the program overseer, if you will, on the waiver issue and others. And again, it's really about education and outreach, but from the state's perspective, it's also making sure that localities or people who are looking to do work are casting a wide net. That is, they're not just perhaps advertising in the Town Tribune, but they are casting a wider net to seek out MWBE opportunities beyond the county line, if you will. So again, I think a lot of it is educational that we need to continue to do. We are also working with ESD to better understand their position on waivers and what additional information may be necessary, because you're correct. Sometimes the waiver requests take long, and of course we don't want that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Assemblyman McDonough.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Commissioner. Good morning. One of my concerns is the transit capital funding, but I know this is going to be a subject that we have to discuss in our budget negotiations, that downstate capital funding seems to be zero in the executive budget proposal. Upstate is doing $20 million. Anyway, but I have another local question, and I'll be very brief. In Nassau County, the Southern State Parkway, I don't know if you've been on it, but there's a section there that is, over the past several years, that has gotten the moniker as Blood Alley, because there's a lot of curves, and it's high speed, of course, and I'm wondering, I don't think we can rebuild the Southern State Parkway, obviously, but if you would seriously address that, because I'm getting over several years, lots of times that people have called or complained about it, and there are severe accidents on there. High speed at turns. I don't know what we can do about lowering this. We can't lower the speed limit usually on a parkway, but I would appreciate if you would look into it, the Southern State Parkway, mostly in western Nassau County. And I'll get back to you with the actual locations and all of that, but if you'd look into it.
I will.
And as I say, it's referred to as Blood Alley.
What, I'm sorry?
Blood Alley, because there's
Blood
many
Alley?
deaths there, yeah.
Blood Alley.
So if you could look into that, I'd appreciate it, and let me know if anything can be done to remediate or develop something for
Okay.
that. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and Chairman, I won't use any more of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Commissioner. It's great to see you. And let me just start by thanking you and your office for the level of professionalism and outreach communication that you've demonstrated over the course of the last several months. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and it's great to see an upstater that recognizes the needs of our community. And I want to touch on some of these needs that are contained in some concerns that I have within the budget. Again, as my colleagues have already pointed out, the issue of parity, I have to bring it up. I'm compelled because it's something that we're hearing with great significance, not only the safety of our roads and bridges and those that are utilizing these roads and bridges every single day in their commutes, but also the workforce, the businesses, and the jobs that are created in ensuring that there is that parity, there is that level playing field. There is a lot of talk of parity, and we want to see it through into actuality, into reality. So we're going to be watching intently of how this unfolds over the course of the next couple of months, but certainly we are all on the same page when it comes to ensuring that our region, which quite frankly in years past has been neglected, and as an upstater yourself, former mayor of Syracuse, you get it. So certainly that's something that is a major concern of ours.
Right.
Another point that I'd like to make in regard to public transit, the operating assistance, again, my colleagues have touched on this already, but my district in particular is impacted with great significance. I represent the city of Buffalo, the city of Lackawanna, town of Cheektowaga. Buffalo Niagara International Airport is in my district. There is the public transit system wholly contained within my district, the light rail. Our community is the only community in upstate with the light rail transit system. And so, it seems like year after year, and I know this is your first budget hearing, but it's my sixth, and year after year we come to the table and we talk about ensuring that Western New York, and in particular the NFTA, because of the fact that it's the only upstate system with a light rail component, is funded to the level that it needs to be. And quite frankly, I believe that the formula needs to be adjusted, and we've talked about renewing the formula in various areas. This is one area that I think needs to be addressed, and I'd like you to touch on that if you could, please.
Sure. Well, I'm pleased to report that the governor has increased upstate transit funding. So, as I mentioned earlier, everyone will see an increase in that. As we go through the long-term needs of a system, there's two sides of that, right? There's the capital side that a system may need, and then there's the operational side as well. And I know, that as I mentioned meeting earlier with many of the transit operators across the state, they're very hardworking. They provide a critically important service, and I say that as a former mayor. It's so critically important to my city, and still is, and is to many of your districts as well. And so they also understand, the need for modernization as well. So I can say to you that there is an increase in this budget, that I'm going to be working very hard with them to better understand and work cooperatively with them going forward to see how we can help them continue to maintain and expand their service. It appears that in Buffalo, the region in Buffalo, and in Albany, kind of the bookends of the state, their ridership is up. It's not that in the middle of the state. And so there's differences throughout, of course, the systems. They have different needs. Some are in more suburban or urban areas, and others are in more rural areas. So there is no one easy, quick answer. But the importance of mass transit, in particular to upstate, is critically important for those who need it most, and in particular, how it supports economic development opportunities. We know that it's a part of the REDC, the transportation piece. The REDC process smartly, has made sure that they're working closely in terms of site selection for specific reuse. When you talk about how you want to develop a particular opportunity, that it's coordinated with the local transit operators as well. So clearly it's an important issue. I'm very personally aware of that, and I'll be working hard with them going forward.
Well, wouldn't it make sense, Commissioner, to include the light rail into this formula as we move forward to ensure that there is equity with the NFTA and other areas of upstate?
Well, I would say to that, because I don't know the answer, I'd like to understand what their revenues are versus their operating expenses versus their capital cost, and look at those kind of on a dashboard, if you will, in comparison with the others, so I could better make an informed decision.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the transit capital needs, the non-MTA, the $20 million. Can you talk a little bit about the formula and how it's going to help systems like the NFTA make more accurate long-term plans moving forward?
Well, I think without being redundant, as I just described, there's additional dollars available for upstate transit. I know that that's going to go a long way in helping them, in particular with their operating expenses. They're very sophisticated, as you know, because every turn of the wheel costs money. And so when they look at their route coverage, where they want to send their vehicles, those are sometimes difficult choices that they need to make as well. So I can't make a promise, and I won't, but what I will say is going forward, I intend, as I told the group, to stay close with them and have a good understanding and be an advocate for them as we develop long-term funding plans.
Thank you. And again, from my perspective, and I know we're well into the game here, but for fear of being redundant, to touch on what some of my other colleagues have mentioned, and we're hearing this from the industry leaders of the timing. And I know, again, you've touched on this already. Is there a way? Look, we can't predict the weather. We know that.
Sure.
You've mentioned that. But we can understand weather patterns and with the timeline to which that we have to deal with. What can we do? What, if anything, can we do to move these projects along? The industry leaders are saying that the money is being held up, the projects are being held up, the jobs are being held up because of the timing to which these projects are let in concert with the weather patterns. What, if anything, can we do here?
Well, I think really it boils down to, for me, better coordination. I think that's going to go a long way, and I think that starts, with the Department of Transportation as well. I mentioned, and you did, the unforeseen circumstances, things happen, they're beyond anybody's control if a project may have started. But having said that, getting it off the ground, I think starts with good coordination. And so that's something that we are working on. I don't have an answer for you today on that, but it is something that I am interested in, that I experienced myself. And part of the policy adjustment I talked about earlier was from a previous experience as well. And so I'm pleased to report to you that we're making progress. I don't have all the answers for you today, but you should know that I understand these challenges. I know the concerns that you hear from your constituency on, and frankly, I consider them all my constituency as well now. And so I'll continue to work hard with my team. I have a great team, great institutional knowledge at DOT, and so we're looking for creative ways to improve what we do as well.
Great, Commissioner. And look, I'm touching on some concerns because we have a very limited amount of time, and I'm done, but I just want to make a point that, there are a lot of positive things contained within this budget for local municipalities, including that Pave New York, when it comes to getting these potholes fixed in the various municipalities that we're working with, especially the more industrialized areas of our state, like the district that I represent, and the older infrastructure. it's important that those funds flow as quickly as possible. So I'm very pleased to see that sort of funding moving forward. I look forward to working with you to make sure that gets spent as quickly as possible. And
Me
thank
as
you
well,
for your
thank
time.
you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblyman Thiel and Assemblywoman Fahey. Next to question, Assemblyman Bendeker.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I'd like to just talk about real quick is obviously you've heard concerns of many of my colleagues on issues and problems and things are taking so much longer than they used to. And I guess where I want to go right away is looking at the workforce of the agency. I mean, we've had a 20% decrease in personnel in the Department of Transportation over the past 9 years. How can you, when you hear us being so concerned about projects not getting off the ground, and I mean, logically, we have to assume you don't have enough people. So I don't understand why we're cutting again this year, another 46 positions from the budget. Why is the Department of Transportation, if they're having such a problem keeping up with the demands of transportation, are you not hiring more people? I mean, I know you must be productive, and that may be the way you're saying, oh, well, we've gotten more productive, so we need less people. Well, think how much more productive you would be if you had kept the staffing level where it was. And I'd like you to explain to me, how you can possibly keep up on snow removal and the time required for all planning of all these projects when you keep on cutting your workforce.
Our snow and ice operations, which are in earnest right now, and our summer maintenance efforts really haven't been, in my opinion, impacted by retirements, attritions, or eliminations of positions. We still have, over 8,200 people for the Department of Transportation. That's a lot of folks. We recognize the importance of our engineering staff, who really are the backbone. By the way, engineers aren't just sitting at an easel drawing out plans for a project. They're doing construction inspection. They're doing bridge inspection, very specific and specialized elements of the engineering field. So, we want to keep them well staffed. I do believe, and I say this to you confidently, that it's not always a staffing issue. There are many other things that come into play in terms of letting procurements or coordination of projects. Many times, locals also aren't always ready. Again, if you're in a local office, you're serving local government, smartly you're trying to bundle as much a grant or other elements of funding that you can before you launch a project. So while a project may be on a particular list for 5 years, it doesn't always reflect that it didn't go because of a DOT effort or funding. Many times there's matches involved, there's local elements that need to take place. So I would say to you that it's kind of a combination of all of those. I just described to you how we're looking at how we might better improve our efficiency internally. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody just about that I've assigned to look at some creative ways that we can do that. So I think it's really a combination of all of those things that perhaps are frustrating to folks, but clearly I'm comfortable with the number of staff we have. We bring on part-time drivers who are operators, if you will, particularly for our snow and ice detail, who do a tremendous job working long hours out there as we speak. So we augment as needed our forces as well. And when you think about it from a long-term kind of business perspective, sometimes you're better served by that. So we do that in snow and ice with our operators. They're part-time folks who come to us during the season when we need them most. We frankly don't need snow operators in July. So I think it's a combination of all of those things.
But having a workforce that is trained to an aspect of not doing a single position that can do more.
That's
so
right.
that in those times when you don't need snowplow drivers, you still need people to do work to make our state continue to move forward in transportation. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying, what we see, I believe, many of my colleagues and I see, is jobs and projects taking too long to get going. And hearing all the various things that you just described sound very logical.
Yeah.
But when I look at your staffing, where you at one time had staffing well over 10,000,
yeah.
And now you're down to 8,200, and you say, oh, but we're comfortable with that because we're productive and we find new creative ways of making it work. We don't want you to find new creative ways. We want it to work. We don't want you to try to be streamlining. We want you to get the manpower that you need to get the projects done that need to be done. Because the longer they take to get done, the more deterioration goes on. And then the more it costs in the long run. And then it reaches a point like we hear when we finally do have to do the work that we have to completely shut down a portion of transportation in an area to now do the critical infrastructure job that has to be done because we didn't do it along when we had the manpower at the time. I'm just saying it's something I really like you to look at.
Understood.
The other thing I just want to talk about quickly is funding to the MTA. As you know from the New York City area, MTA funding is of the utmost importance. MTA transportation for our trains and our buses, especially in Queens where I'm from, bus service is so vitally important. And I see that in this budget, the MTA is going to get an increase of $22 million, which is a 0.49% increase. Is that correct?
The MTA in our budget?
Yes.
Well, they'll be receiving, out of the mass transit statewide, they'll be receiving about $4.7 billion.
Correct, but that's
So there's $303 million available.
0.49% increase over last year. Okay, the funding for some other areas, like some of the upstate transportation areas, got a 2.7% increase. Is there a particular reason why the MTA funding in the city of New York and the critical infrastructure and equipment that we need only got less than a 0.5% increase?
Well, I can't speak to the MTA, and I won't. I can tell you that as part of that budget, also in other downstate areas, other transit operators have received about $303 million. And as I pointed out earlier, $194 million will be for the remainder of the upstate transit operators.
Correct. The $303 million that you're talking about, though, is for non-MTA downstate transit, which, by the way, got no increase. So non-MTA downstate transit got absolutely no increase at all. They have flat funding. The MTA got a 0.49% increase, but upstate got 2.7%, where I think there's so much transportation needs in the city, and the MTA is trying to do as much as it can. Why New York State DOT is going to cut their portion or give such a minuscule little amount of an increase doesn't seem very logical or fair to my constituents in my area. So I obviously I would advocate for a larger amount of funding for the MTA, and I would also say that leaving the non-MTA flat is not reflective of the needs either. With increased cost in wages and insurance and other aspects to keep something funding is going flat is going to be result in a service cut to my constituents.